Friends, if everyone can find your seats. Gemar Chatima Tava and Shana Tava, and thank you all for joining us. It is such a privilege to get together in this very sacred hour before Mincha and Ne'ilah to have Professor Stephen Greenblatt speak to us. Stephen, we're so grateful that you are here at this holy hour. Stephen Greenblatt, thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Garden-Schwartz. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here. My wife, Rami, and I spend a lot of time in Vermont, where we are fortunate enough to have an old farmhouse with acres of orchards and meadows and deep, deep woods. Each spring when the snows have melted and we walk along the hiking trails that we've made, we come across not merely branches that have fallen, but whole large trees that have been knocked down by the winter storms every year. The trees are lying on their sides, the roots are painfully exposed, and almost always these are trees that grew often to extraordinary height, where there was abundant water, but very, very little soil. The exposed roots are shallow. They were growing on the flat ledges of glacial rocks that are plentiful in Vermont, and they were unable to reach deep down into the earth. They could sprout, they could make it through more than one season, they could even flourish. But when the violent winds began to blow, they couldn't remain standing. The trees that survive the long winters have deep, often gnarled and twisted roots. And as we've only recently learned from scientific studies, these roots are in some form of mute communication with other trees around them, from which in times of distress they actually receive nourishment. Maybe you've read accounts of this, quite remarkable recent discovery. I tell you all this because I'm standing in the place where my roots reach the deepest into the soil, and I'm among people whose roots nourish my own. Temple Emanuel, this space, in a slightly earlier incarnation, was in many ways at the center of my parents' lives and hence of my own life when I was growing up. My parents loved this community and its rituals and its practices. We came to shul constantly, on the Sabbath, of course, and holidays, but also on many other occasions. My mother was active in the sisterhood. My father, throwing himself with characteristic energy and joy into temple affairs, had a succession of offices, including president. Their talk at home was frequently about what seemed to me the mysteriously complex tangle of personalities and issues that swirled around the life of the synagogue. There's no business like shul business, my father would always laughingly say. So what does it mean to me, for me to stand in the sanctuary where I spent so many hours of my childhood and adolescence? It's a scene so redolent of my whole family. My feelings are not unmixed with sadness. I think of my beloved cousin, Sue Karp-Nessen, Dan's wife, who's no longer with us. My parents, my aunts and uncles, my older cousins, including Sue's wonderful mother, B. Karp, are all gone. But for the most part, these losses, painful though they are, came at the appointed time. And I cannot pretend to myself that most of the loved ones who now surge up in my mind should actually still be with us in the sanctuary. My father, may he rest in peace, would have been 126 years old. My mother, 113. They're with me where they belong, in my memory, in my mind, in my heart. I have lots of memories of these occasions. I remember how on Erev Yom Kippur, if the Red Sox were playing a crucial game the next day, my father would turn the television on before sundown so that he could watch it without violating the prohibition against lighting a fire I remember how my mother and her sisters would almost instantly break down and weep for their parents and other loved ones during the Yizka service, as if a switch had been turned. I remember, too, how ardently my parents chanted certain of the prayers, especially Salach Lan. And mostly, of course, I remember how endless the services seemed to me as a child, and how Ne'ilah, in particular, stretched out to what felt like an eternity. Our rabbi in those days long ago was a figure of unbending dignity, sobriety, and solemnity named Albert I. Gordon. A few of you maybe may remember him. When he raised his arms and recited the priestly benediction over the congregation, my parents told me to bow my head and keep my eyes lowered, since God was passing through the synagogue. Given Rabbi Gordon's solemnity, I could well believe it. But I was desperate to catch a glimpse of God. Since I'd been taught that it was death to see God face to face, I knew that such a glimpse would be fatal. Still, I couldn't quell my desire. A long time passed before I could muster the courage. But finally, one morning, standing with my head bowed, I conquered my fear of death. Slowly, slowly, while the rabbi solemnly intoned the ancient blessings, I lifted my head and raised my eyes. The air above my head was completely empty, and I found that I was by no means alone in looking around the sanctuary. Many of the worshipers were glancing around, they were staring out of the windows, or they're gesturing to friends, mouthing greetings, and I was filled with outrage. I have been lied to. Many years have gone by since this moment, and I have never recovered the naive faith that led me to be willing to sacrifice my life for a vision of God. But something lives in me on the other side of lost illusions. I've come to realize that when I looked up that day, and for that matter, when I had my head bowed down, God was in fact present in the special sense that Baruch Spinoza captured in his famous formula in Latin, Deus sive natura. That means God, or in other words, nature. To the shame of the Amsterdam Jewish community, Spinoza was excommunicated for his views, but I think his understanding is implicit in the Torah, when the universe emerges from the dark hole, tohu v'bohu, or when, after the ecological catastrophe of the flood, Noah sees the rainbow in the sky, or more modestly, in our waving of the lulav at Sukkot, or more modestly still, in the wonderful prayer, Asher Yatzah, that Orthodox Jews recite every day upon first urinating or defecating. At the root of that prayer is gratitude for the simple, ordinary structure and functioning of the body. Nekavim, nekavim, halolim, halolim. And wonder at the fact of existence itself. Far from reducing that wonder, contemporary science has intensified it. Each of our lives, and for that matter, the blue marble on which we live our lives, is a miracle. Among the sins for which we should repent on this day is surely our collective failure to love and honor and take adequate care of the planet on which we live. If we were able to grasp the full meaning of Spinoza's formula, God, or in other words, nature, then we might be able to pull back from the exploitation, the carelessness, the profiteering and indifference that's poisoning our planet, and to recover some sense of terrestrial existence as a garden planted by God, in which the biblical myth placed the first humans. Of course, the myth also has God say to those humans, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. The vision of seemingly limitless population increase and of human domination over all other living creatures has turned out to be part of the problem. But perhaps we can say, as Rashi did more than 1,000 years ago, that when God used the word rule in enjoining humans to rule over every creature, he implied rule wisely. Without such wisdom, in Rashi's view, humans would sink lower than the beasts. Rashi's commentary, along with innumerable others, returns me to another aspect of the place that I'm standing today. For 6 years, I came to Temple Emanuel Hebrew School 3 days a week. The sad truth is that I learned pathetically little. Not the school's fault, my fault. Though in public school I was an eager and attentive student, I somehow resisted the proper Hebrew education that I now actually ardently wish I had. But here too, something lives in me on the other side of failure. I've come to understand how much I owe to the culture of which the Hebrew school was a part. I was always half amused and half mystified that my mother, who was born in Boston, had an ineffable sense of pride that her grandfather in Vilna, whom she had never met, was a scholar, by which I assume she meant that he spent his days studying the Talmud while his long-suffering wife ran a little shop, swept the house, tended to the chickens, and raised the family. For my mother, being a scholar was tantamount to being an aristocrat. In our modest house on Manet Road, we had relatively few books, but among them there were the 12 heavy volumes bound in tool leather of the Jewish Encyclopedia. In their grandeur and heft, these scholarly tomes, which are actually highly regarded even today as the culminating monument of what the Germans called the Wissenschaft des Judentums, that's to say the science, the learning of Judaism, these were an anomaly on our meager shelves. In 1936, in the depths of the Depression, with very little money to spare, my father had bought this expensive set to honor the memory of his father, an unskilled immigrant from Lithuania who had eked out a meager living in Boston as a ragpicker. The extravagant purchase says everything about the symbolic importance of learning in the Jewish identity of both of my parents. The synagogue, as you probably know, has always been closely bound up with a Beit Midrash, a house of study. Indeed, the house of study was considered even holier than the synagogue because the former, the Beit Midrash, is used for both study and prayer, while the synagogue is used for prayer alone. That the Beit Midrash was for centuries an exclusively male world, and that for some fellow Jews it remains so, is part of our legacy that we have to confront, just as Israelis are currently confronting their legacy of exempting yeshiva scholars, some yeshiva scholars, from military service. These are contingent historical developments that only emerged over time around a central Jewish value and may therefore be contested and reversed. But the central value, the emphasis placed upon learning, is crucial and has long remained unchanged. Hence my mother's pride, and hence too my father's decision, his compulsion really, to purchase the massive volumes of the Jewish Encyclopedia. It is for me enormously revealing that while some major religions imagine the afterlife of the blessed as a place of mystical contemplation, and others imagined it as a place of supreme bodily gratification, the rabbis imagined it as a place of uninterrupted study. So too, Jews never developed an elaborate conception of hell, of the kind that Dante made famous. Sheol, the Jewish underworld where souls go after death, is simply a place of darkness, oddly reminiscent of Groucho Marx's quip, outside of a dog, a book is man's best friend. Inside of a dog, it's too dark to read. For Jews, hell, like the inside of a dog, is the place where it's too dark to read. And then they wonder why Jews have traditionally done well in school. It's one of the paradoxical virtues of Judaism that it never developed a coherent theology in the manner of the great medieval scholastic philosophers, Albertus Magnus or Thomas Aquinas. Even Maimonides, who was invoked wonderfully this morning, didn't produce a massive synthesis of the kind that the Thomists had. Instead, Judaism launched itself into an endless project of challenge, debate, and interpretive disagreement. Hence the intense arguments that characterize the Talmud, and hence, too, the ferocious critique to which we pay homage on this day when we recite Isaiah's contempt for merely formal observance and his celebrated reinterpretation of what it really means to fast. My parents fasted on Yom Kippur, but they knew that the fast was only an outward sign. Far from feeling righteous, they were haunted all of their lives by a sense that they and the American Jewish community to which they belonged, and the entire nation to which that community in turn belonged, had not done nearly enough to save their own flesh and blood, that is, to offer sanctuaries to the Jews in Europe who were menaced by Nazi tyranny. Before the Second World War, my father participated in lobbying efforts to get the United States to increase the number of refugees it was willing to admit. Those efforts, tragically, were unsuccessful. And during the war, he was part of a delegation that went to Washington to plead with President Roosevelt to order the bombing of the rail lines to Auschwitz and other death camps. They met with the president's chief foreign policy advisor, Harry Hopkins, who coolly informed them that the country had a war to fight and could not be expected to divert its planes to non-military targets. My parents talked about this failure constantly. When on weekends they took my brother Marty and me on rides to what they called the country, by which they meant Lincoln or Sudbury, they would look out the window at the fields that we were passing, and they would sigh. I can still hear those sighs. I knew exactly what the sigh meant and what would inevitably follow. There was plenty of room, they would say. So many Jews could have been brought here and saved from the gas chambers. I confess to you with some shame that I grew to hate these laments, which always introduced what seemed to me a bitter note into our otherwise carefree outings to the Wayside Inn, the old grist mill, and the penny candy shop. But they left a trace in me, a specifically Jewish trace, that had an unexpected outcome, an outcome that I want to share briefly with you. When, after a long stint of teaching at the University of California in Berkeley, I came to Harvard more than 25 years ago, I was struck by the university's immense resources and by the spectacular generosity of its alumni and its friends. Here at last, I thought, was an opportunity to do something of the kind that my parents had so much regretted not doing. I had long understood that some of the most remarkable figures whom I was encountering in my studies, the literary critic Erich Auerbach, the philosopher Hannah Arendt, the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, not to mention Albert Einstein, were precisely Jewish scholars who had been saved, quite a few of them, in fact, by the Harvard-educated Variant Fry. I decided, try to persuade Harvard to help scholars around the world who found themselves similarly persecuted and endangered, whether for reasons of race or religion or ethnicity or political principle. We would do what only a painfully small number of American institutions, including notably several historically black colleges and universities who stood out in this regard, had done to save Jewish refugees in the 1930s and early 40s. I founded a network called Scholars at Risk, devoted to the project of offering such help, had been recently started at the University of Chicago, and in fact that I knew one of its founders, the human rights legal scholar Jacqueline Baba. I went to Harvard's president at the time, Larry Summers, and I made the case that Harvard should join this network by providing funds to bring one or more scholars every year to our campus. We would offer them a year's refuge, time to resume work, establish connections with colleagues here and elsewhere, and make plans for their future. Larry Summers, the president, asked me a series of probing, skeptical, and often difficult questions. Anyone who has ever met Larry Summers will know what I'm describing. But in the end, he agreed to grant us modest funding for a limited period of time to enable us to get started. Our first Scholar at Risk fellow, Barangis Kar, was an Iranian journalist, attorney, and a leading human rights activist. The author of the book Crossing the Red Line, The Struggle for Human Rights in Iran, she was sentenced to 4 years of imprisonment on charges of acting against national security and disseminating propaganda against the Islamic regime. She spent 2 months in Tehran's notorious Evin prison, where she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And as a high-profile figure, she was then released and permitted to come to the United States for treatment. And from there, she became a Scholar at Risk Fellow at Harvard, an appointment that was followed by others at our institution and at other institutions in the United States. In April of 2012, Ms. Carr's husband, a persecuted journalist who had been a prisoner himself and had since been living under house arrest, took his own life, unable to cope with the pain of separation from his wife and his children. Marengus Carr herself continues her work and is now living in Canada with her daughters. Another of our first scholars was Mesfin Woldemariam, an Ethiopian professor of geography who had been imprisoned after calling into question the official account of the origins of famine in his country. At the end of his year here, he decided to return to Addis Ababa, where we hoped that the recognition by Harvard would provide him a measure of protection. But he was immediately arrested again, and after a guilty verdict, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. So much for our fatuous belief in the magic of Harvard's glorious name. After this, we operated on the assumption that many of our scholars would not be able to return to their countries of origin, and we arranged for help from lawyers who were always generously willing to provide counsel for asylum applications. Widespread generosity has been the key to our ability to continue and to thrive. We found a fantastically dedicated and resourceful administrator, and with her help, we began to draw upon the university's extraordinary intellectual and human resources. As the program became better known, we were deluged with nominations and applications from all over the world. Gradually, we increased our support, including funds for an annual fellowship from Radcliffe, and we expanded the number of scholars whom we could invite, though always only a tiny number of those whose urgent cases came to our attention, and we always have had to practice very painful kind of choice. The task is not an easy one. Every bit of it is difficult, from the often nightmarish logistics of visas and travel to settling the new arrivals and their families here after their disorienting and traumatizing experiences, to integrating them into the Harvard and the larger Boston community. Funding is a perennial problem, and in the wake of the impact upon Harvard of the financial collapse of 2007, we entered Pharaoh's lean years. But we managed to keep going. We are a small group of academics, not skilled fundraisers, but we've both made and received contributions, including, to my utter surprise and delight, a modest bequest, the first one we received from a Palestinian physician who somehow heard about us and wrote us into her will. By now, we have given sanctuary to more than 100 fellows from such countries as Iran, Afghanistan, Cambodia, Cuba, Ethiopia, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Yemen, Egypt, Russia, China, and Turkey. Their range of disciplines is enormous, from robotics to jurisprudence, physics to structural linguistics, psychiatry to literary criticism. And we've expanded our scope by including in our definition of scholars creative writers and artists, librarians, cultural heritage workers, women's rights and women's health advocates, as well as professionals like lawyers and physicians whose publications or activities have led to persecution. Ordinarily, we can invite somewhere between 3 and 7 fellows together with their families every year. This, modest as it is, has made us the most active institution in the entire Scholars at Risk network in the world. And in the exceptional and exceptionally ghastly circumstances of the past 2 years, we've managed almost miraculously to extend invitations to 24 Afghans and their families, and to a significant team of Ukrainian trauma surgeons. An often repeated phrase at Harvard, every tub on its own bottom, gestures toward the structural independence from one another of the various units, the business school, medical school, law school, faculty of arts and sciences, and so forth, of which the university as a whole consists. But not so with Scholars at Risk. In this enterprise, we are one university. And I want to give you a single example. A few years ago, we had an application from a Nigerian poet, Romeo Oregon, his name was. He had won a major prize for his poetry, but the newspaper account of the prize in Lagos, whether inadvertently or maliciously, mentioned that he was gay. Unfortunately, largely through the efforts of American Christian evangelicals, there's been a rising tide of homophobia in Africa. The poet was tracked down and beaten within an inch of his life. He fled to neighboring Ghana, where, when we heard from him, he was in hiding. When he finally reached Harvard, he was a mess, both physically and psychologically. And shortly after his arrival, he attempted to end his life, fortunately without success. When I visited him in the hospital and spoke with him at some length, it appeared that at the center of his despair was his appearance. And in truth, his mouth with its row of ragged, broken teeth looked awful. But I phoned the dean of Harvard's dental school, who immediately agreed to undertake to fix the damage. The poet gradually recovered in spirit as well as in appearance. He began to write again. He received a full scholarship from the prestigious Iowa Writers' Workshop, and he's now a professor at Iowa State. He recently received the Nigerian National Literary Prize, the country's highest recognition. I could give you other examples, but it's time to start bringing these remarks to a close. I want to return for a moment to where I began, in the fields and the woods of Vermont. My parents never saw the place where my wife and I spend such sweet, quiet time. They were both gone when we acquired it in 2001. But I know what they would have said had we been able to show it to them. So much land, they would have sighed. It would have been possible to save the lives of so many Jews who perished in the Holocaust. Well, Mom and Dad, I don't believe that any of those to whom we have thus far given refuge as scholars at risk have been Jewish. But I want you to know that for me at least, the whole project is a profoundly Jewish one. And not, I suspect, for me alone. It cannot be unrelated to Judaism that it was Larry Summers who gave us the original go-ahead and support, or that the support was continued even in financially straitened times by the provosts Steve Hyman and Alan Garber. And I know for a fact that it was not unrelated to Judaism that over the past 5 years, our most wholehearted, thoughtful, and generous support, both institutional and personal, has come from President Larry Bacow. Every year in the fall, we have a small informal gathering to bring together the year's scholars at risk and their families in order to introduce them to one another and to our small advisory committee. We've always sent a pro forma invitation to Harvard's president, though without any expectation that the invitation would be accepted, and not surprisingly, it never was. Not, that is, until Larry Bacow. The very first time we invited him, he not only came, accompanied by his wonderful chief of staff, but he also introduced himself individually to each of the scholars, who were, as you will imagine, utterly astonished that they were meeting the president of Harvard. He then spoke simply and movingly about what the program meant to him personally, as the child of a mother who had survived Auschwitz and had herself been a refugee. Their presence at Harvard, he said, was part of the task of tikkun olam, the repair of the world. There's a short story some of you may know by the great Yiddish writer I.L. Peretz, and in fact, this occasion was presented as a commentary on this story. And what I want you to know is that I've been actually giving you a commentary on the story for the last 25 minutes. The story concerns the rabbi of the village of Nemirov, who was nowhere to be found at the time of the penitential prayers that lead up to the high holidays and fast days. The pious villagers credulously believed that the missing rabbi must be ascending to heaven. But a skeptical Litvak hides under the rabbi's bed all night in order to discover the secret. Early in the morning, he hears the bed creak. I'm going to let Peretz narrate the rest. Finally, the rabbi, long life to him, arises. First, he does what befits a Jew. Then he goes to the clothes closet and takes out a bundle of peasant clothes, linen trousers, high boots, a coat, a big felt hat, and a long, wide leather belt studded with brass nails. The rabbi gets dressed. From his coat pocket dangles the end of a heavy peasant rope. The rabbi leaves and the Litvak follows. On the way, the rabbi stops in the kitchen, bends down, takes an axe from the bed, puts it into his belt, and leaves the house. The Litvak trembles, but continues to follow. The hushed dread of the days of awe hangs over the dark streets. Every once in a while, a cry rises from some minyan reciting the penitential prayers, or from a sickbed. The rabbi hugs the sides of the streets, keeping to the shade of the houses. He glides from house to house, and the Litvak after him. The Litvak hears the sound of his heartbeats mingling with the sound of the rabbi's heavy steps, but he keeps on going and follows the rabbi to the outskirts of the town. A small wood stands just outside the town. The rabbi, long life to him, so long your rabbi, enters the wood. He takes 30 or 40 steps and stops by a small tree. The Litvak, overcome with amazement, watches the rabbi take the axe out of his belt and strike the tree. He hears the tree creak and fall. The rabbi chops the tree into logs and the logs into sticks. Then he makes a bundle of the wood and ties it with a rope in his pocket. He puts the bundle of wood on his back, shoves the axe back into his belt, and returns to the town. He stops at a back street beside a small, broken-down shack and knocks at the window. "Who's there?" asks a frightened voice. The Litvak recognizes it as the voice of a sick Jewish woman. "I," answers the rabbi in the accent of a peasant. "Who is I?" Again the rabbi answers in Russian, "Vasil." "Who is Vasil? And what do you want?" "I have wood to sell, very cheap." And not waiting for the woman's reply, he goes into the house. The Litvak steals in after him. In the gray light of the early morning, he sees a poor room with broken, miserable furnishings. A sick woman wrapped in rags lies on the bed. She complains bitterly, "Buy? How can I buy? Where will a poor widow get money?" "I'll lend it to you," answers the supposed Vasil. "It's only 6 cents. "And how will I ever pay you back?" asks the poor woman, groaning. "Foolish one," says the rabbi reproachfully. "See, you're a poor sick Jew, and I'm ready to trust you with a little wood. I'm sure you'll pay, while you have such a great and mighty God, and you don't trust him for 6 cents? "And who will kindle a fire?" asks the widow. "Have I the strength to get up? My son is at work." "I'll kindle the fire," answers the rabbi. As the rabbi puts the wood into the oven, he recited in a groan the first portion of the penitential prayers. As he kindled the fire and the wood burned brightly, he recited a bit more joyously the second portion of the penitential prayers. When the fire was set, he recited the third portion and shut the stove. The Litvak, who saw all this, became a disciple of the rabbi. And ever after, when another disciple tells how the rabbi of Nemirov ascends to heaven at the time of the penitential prayers, the Litvak does not laugh. He only adds quietly, "if not higher." The world, as I'm sure you know, is in desperate need of repair. And as Jews, it is our obligation to emulate the rabbi of Nemirov and to commit ourselves to participate in the work of Tikkun Olam. As this Day of Atonement approaches its end, we may not ascend to heaven, but I, skeptical Litvak that I am, I pray that in the year to come, we may find ways to lift ourselves up at least a few inches. Thank you very much.
Stephen, first of all, thank you so much. And your words were so soulful. And by soulful, I mean, here you are, the Cogan University Professor of this or that at Harvard and the preeminent Shakespeare, and you're the son of two parents who you love so deeply. You are the son of two parents who were deeply connected to this place, and your words about them and their roots, into which grounded you into this place, were so moving. And then your words about the Scholar at Risk program at Harvard and other places, and the incredible work that you and your colleagues have done to literally save lives, are just the instantiation of the Tikkun Olam that you brought in the Peretz story, and also the artistry of beginning with trees and ending with trees, and beginning with trees that are deeply rooted and ending with trees that are cut down out of values that are deeply rooted, was so artistic. You really should be a professor. So first of all, just a huge thank you.
Pleasure. No, pleasure.
I have a lot of questions, but I thought maybe I would just invite maybe 2 or 3 questions of Stephen about his talk, and if not, I'm more than happy to ask. But anyone here would like to ask a question? So, Ben Kaplan. Thank you, Ben.
So in today's New York Times, which I had the opportunity to read pretty much cover to cover this morning before services. No, before. There was unfortunate mention that a professor named Raheel Dawood, I think, who's a professor who studied the Uyghurs in China, had been arrested in 2017, and it turns out now it's revealed that she is serving a life sentence in China for her support of the Uyghurs. And I guess my question is, what are you guys doing? What could you do for her, and what are you doing for other scholars in that situation?
Thank you. For her, I don't know. That is to say, there are, as you probably know, that article presumably in itself is an attempt to call the world's attention to this. We have had now, of the 100 that we've had, 2 or even 3 Uyghur scholars, one of whom actually taught Uyghur at Harvard during his Scholar at Risk year. All 3 of them had been asked to spy on, they were scholars in China, professors, but Uyghurs, and had been asked to spy on the Uyghur community, and had refused and had got in tremendous trouble, as you could imagine, for it, and managed to get out. Once you're in prison, it's very difficult to know what to do, and in fact, it's rather complicated and sensitive for Harvard, particularly for any university, because often universities like Harvard have ongoing relations with other Chinese institutions. So part of the delicacy of this enterprise is that we try to act in ways that will not compromise the relations that we have often with other institutions and with other professors in that world, so as not to put them on the spot. But it is the case that we're very much aware of the problem of the Uyghurs and the persecution of the Uyghurs in China. China is so powerful and so important that it's a very delicate matter to, but we don't want to say we can't divert the plane to bomb the tracks. We want to balance some attempt to help with the delicacy of this situation, diplomatic situation.
I have a few questions, Stephen. First of all, could you speak to, if you know, the interior lives of the scholars at risk that have been saved, who they've been saved, but yet their family, etc., their homeland their homeland is still at risk. Presumably people in their family that they grew up with are still at risk and compromised, and here they are in leafy, beautiful Cambridge. So there's culture changes, culture shock, like, wow, it's very different from Afghanistan, and navigating that, and then just navigating the fact that their loved ones back home are there. How could you speak to the interior lives?
One of the reasons that the Scholar at Risk program has given its small size, has been relatively expensive, is that we make every effort to take the whole family out. And in most cases, we've been able to do that, usually because the oppressive government doesn't care about the rest of the family, and it's just, if they're going to let one go, they'll let the group go. The Iranian situation was a different one. The Iranians have been, on the whole, nastier about this and have not allowed people to bring families. But so the first thing to say is that mostly we are worrying about how to get warm clothes for people who for their children and so forth and so on. We've had actually several babies born here as well. That said, what you point to is a serious issue, often, first of all, particularly because we expected, originally, naively, we expected people were going to be able to go back. But they're not able to go back for the most part. Once they come here, then they generally are not. And the few cases where they have, for example, we had a Cuban poet who was here for a year, and he wanted to go back. He went back, and like that Ethiopian, was arrested immediately. So they're in a situation in which they feel lots of guilt, of the survival guilt, which is a familiar phenomenon for Jews as well, historically. And we try to, the best thing we can do, we have psychological services, we have social services, but we try to get the person to feel more integrated into, not isolated, integrated into a community, to be able to talk again to people in their world, their intellectual and academic world, as well as to integrate them into a social world. But it's very hard. And it has been, it's the first thing we think about. We can't just bring them here, miraculously put them down and say, enjoy yourselves. That's not how it works. We have to spend a lot of time. And I should say, it's not me, it's remarkable. Person I mentioned, our administrator, Jane Unruh, spends a huge amount of time. We have lots of volunteers. The nice thing to say, a little bit like the dental school, is that people are actually quite generous. I mean, often we think of people, and I confess, I think of people as miserable wretches, but actually, in this regard, they're incredible. They're incredible not only within the university, though people are just extraordinarily generous that way, but within the larger community.
And Stephen, could you just say a word about how this story ends? When you bring a scholar at risk and their family, and they teach at Harvard or whatever institution they're at for a year, and then what happens year 2, 3, 4, year 5 down the road, especially if they can't go back home?
Well, the first and most important thing is to get a legal situation so that we have lawyers who can help them with asylum applications. And then we get to work finding them positions, if they're academics, to try to find them academic positions. And we've been quite successful, partly because often these people are, it's rare to find Albert Einstein, I understand, but these people are often quite accomplished, which is one of the reasons they've got in tremendous trouble, because they've been visible somehow to the regime. And so I've been at least as successful placing them in good positions as I have my graduate students in academic positions in different parts of the country, or if they're jurists or if they're physicians, finding them appropriate positions that way.
So, Stephen, again, kol hakavod to you and to Larry and all your colleagues who have made this possible. I want to flip the script for a second, and I want to channel your mom and your dad, and I want to channel their groans on those Sunday drives into the country that, as a kid, you didn't love so much, but that is with you now. Because as I'm hearing the Scholars at Risk program, I have a split-screen TV. One side is, oh my God, wow, what a mitzvah. If you save a single life, you save the universe. And how many lives have you saved? And kol hakavod, that's amazing. That's one side of the screen TV. I mean, just like beautiful instantiation of Tikkun Olam. The other side is, all those people are rock stars in their fields. They're poets, and they win this award and that award, and they're scientists, and they're brilliant academicians. And the image that comes to my mind on the other end of the screen TV is what you wake up to every morning, which is desperate immigrants from Latin America who are not poet laureates, and they're so desperate that they'll climb onto a moving train.
Yeah.
They're so desperate that they'll swim in fetid waters. They're so desperate that they'll crawl underneath razory fences. And they're so desperate that they'll do all that. And if they survive all that, their prize at the end of the journey is they get to turn themselves into law enforcement. And then they're just stuck in the system. And so how do you personally, you're neshama, how do you process that? And that is the people who are not rock stars who are on the tops of moving trains. And I'd love to just ask, since Ne'ilah is almost upon us and the gates are closing, what Harvard does is amazing. What can we do as individual citizens, as individual Jews? What can we do to make our contribution to a better world, given, as you point out, how desperately it needs to be redeemed?
I wish I had a very good answer to that question. You spoke beautifully this morning as well about those images which are seared in all of our minds. There was one in the newspaper yesterday or the day before that in the Wall Street Journal maybe that startled me, precisely of people crawling under razor wire, desperately trying to get to what will be a terrible situation when they get there. I don't know the answer to this. I wish I did. All countries, there are reasons why countries have borders. I mean, this is a world in which migrations are even desperate migrations have to be orderly and controlled and in the interest of the country as well as the migrants. The politicians we elect have to think hard about how to do that. What I would start, this is not a very good answer, but I would start by saying I try to resist the obvious attempt to excite rage and anger at these people, because that seems to me unworthy of a human being. But we know that that's done all the time, not only in the United States, but anywhere where there are these, in Italy, for example, in Lampedusa, where there are comparable problems. So the first thing is that there are always going to be people who try to take advantage of the anxiety that people legitimately feel at the idea that we don't live on a border like that. We don't live in South Texas, so we're not dealing with it this way. But we have to resist what I think of as the actual wickedness of trying to stir up hatred over these issues, and have to think rationally and sensitively in a human rights way about these issues, about the children involved and the families involved. And then it's going to be expensive. And we have to be willing to pay the price. And we also have to be willing not simply to, if we're going to admit large numbers of people, it's not the scholars at risk situation, but not simply to admit them, but to figure out what's going to happen to them and how they're going to be absorbed in our country. That is to say, it's a matter for serious people and not simply for people on one side or another trying to rile people up in rage or in grief.
Yeah, so Stephen, I want to bring this to a close by coming back to the Peretz story, because there's obviously, in the Peretz story, there's systemic poverty. She's a sick, poor woman. He doesn't solve systemic problems. He doesn't solve them at the roots. He provides immediate relief to this one woman for one night that she shouldn't be cold. I'm wondering, what do you see as the lesson of the Peretz story to us today at Ne'ilah time? What does it tell us about the promise of our impact and what we might do?
I mean, I think you've already put your finger on the force of the Peretz story, which is that it's not a grand gesture. I mean, it is a grand gesture in its way, but it looks very modest. It's offering a very small thing to one suffering person, not as you say, not a solution for the global solution. But it has to start there. I mean, I say this self-reproachfully because I do all too little of this kind, as I think many of us do all too little of this kind. I mean, of just the most modest thing. I mean, starting with the tzedakah, with what you can, it's easy, that's easy. It's just a question of being slightly more generous than one is, but it also extends to we're always encountering people, even if we block it out all the time, who actually are asking something of us. And if we stop for a second and think, yes, I will do that. I will offer that very small measure of help. It raises us up a millimeter off the ground, not to heaven, but enough millimeters will get us higher than we are.
Well, Stephen, thank you for inspiring us to go higher than we are, and that is a really serious approach to a complicated world, to kind of try to be like that rabbi in the Peretz story and make a difference to the person before you. And if all of us could make more of a difference to the person before us, we'd all be a little bit higher and have a little bit of a better world. So, Stephen, thank you so much for your Torah. And I don't know what your spiritual beliefs are, but mine are that your mother and father are in heaven shining down upon you, and really proud that you have inspired their community on this day. Thank you so much. Thank you. We are going to take a 10-minute break and begin with Mincha at 5:30.